Hey guys, Dr. Stitzel here. So our topic today is monopoly. When we start talking about monopoly, the first thing we have to think about is market power. So market power is the ability to raise price above marginal cost without other firms entering the market. Following the definition that Cowan and Tabarrok used in their textbook, they say monopoly is a firm with market power. Of course, your traditional definitions would say monopoly is when there's just one firm in a market. Of course, Cowan and Tabarrok are pointing out if you have just one firm, but they give you the competitive output because they don't have any individual market power, what is it that makes them a monopoly? Which you'll see a lot of this discussion in the other video associated with this module. Okay, so let's talk about marginal revenue and marginal cost before we move on to talking about monopoly. Remember that marginal revenue is the change in total revenue from selling an additional unit, while marginal cost is the change in total cost from producing an additional unit. We want to talk about these because these are what form a firm. So let's start by talking about how marginal revenue impacts the choice that a monopoly makes. We've already seen the firm decision and how it is that this works out. So all of this somewhat familiar to you, but I'm going to go ahead and go through it because I want to demonstrate how it is that marginal revenue ends up falling faster than demand. Before I do that, I want to draw our attention back to this idea that demand is your willingness to pay, which then is where the firm ends up getting the price from, right? So demand, willingness to pay, price, all tied together. So obviously, when we're measuring marginal revenue, the first point here, you're not going to have any marginal revenue. That's the first data point. So if we go from here to here, you've got an increase of 1 in your quantity output, and the associated change in revenue is $14. So we're saying the marginal revenue is $14 per every 1 unit. So we can just express that as 14. Okay. Continuing, we're going to see that if you increase the price, if you decrease the price, you will increase the quantity. So if you decrease it from 16 to 14, you'll increase the quantity from 2 units sold to 3 units sold. You see that the marginal revenue ends up being 10. I'm going to complete this table and then come back around to the idea why marginal revenue falls faster than demand. Okay, so our next data point is 6, and then 2, and then -2. So here I want to make an important observation. It is possible for marginal revenue to be negative, and that's tied in with the idea of why marginal revenue falls faster than demand. Notice that I've even drawn the marginal revenue having reached negative numbers here. So let's explore why it is that marginal revenue falls faster than demand. If you can charge every consumer exactly their willingness to pay, the demand and the marginal revenue curve would be the same. But in this case, we can't do that. And in most cases, you can't do that. Instead, you have to charge one price to everyone, and that induces more people to buy. Hence, the quantities going up as we lower the price, right? That's just downward sloping demand curve, everything that we're accustomed to. So we lower the price, say from 16 to down to 14, and that induces another sale. But what happened? Well, previously we had 2 units, right? We had 2 units, and we sold each of those at $16. Now, when we sell those same 2 units, they're going to be sold at $14. That means this distance here, right? So there's a decrease of 2 from here to here, and we have 2 units here. That's going to actually give us a -4 in terms of the revenue that we're getting from selling those units, right? But we're going to sell an entire extra unit by moving from here to here, right? So we get 14. Let's just do this, right? Marginal revenue. So for our first 2 units, so we could say like marginal revenue 1, so that's 16 times 2, so that's how we got the 32. Notice that that's the same as this number here, right? For our second unit, we sold those original 2 units also at 14, plus an extra one at 14. So if we're not careful, we say, oh, there's the additional revenue, but we got to remember that we actually lost some here. So that's the same as saying, well, what you end up with is that you lost 4 units of revenue here, and then you gained 14 for a total of a positive 10 marginal revenue. That's this number here. That's this number here associated with selling the 14th unit. So if we're all the way down here, what happened? Well, by lowering the price, we induced another additional unit, but these other 10 units, these other 5 units that were being sold at $10 are now only sold at $8. So we lose more than we gain on the previous units that we would be selling than we gain from selling the additional unit, right? So we sold 5 more at $2 less. We sold the original 5 at $2 less here. So we lost $10 in revenue, and we only gained 1 unit at $8 price. So we lost $2. Okay. So just a reminder of why marginal revenue falls faster than demand. So what happens when a monopoly gets to choose its price and engage in its behavior, right? So if we remember, our marginal cost is the same thing as our supply curve, and then we're going to calculate our profit sort of based on the relative price and average total cost. So we've done all this in previous videos. Just a quick refresher of what's happening here. Okay, so first thing that I want to talk about is the equilibrium outcome, right? Looks something like this, because that's where supply and demand get together. So here's our quantity that would be produced under competition, right? So what is it that the firm does? Well, the monopoly wants to produce here, right? And so they'll go through, produce the quantity associated with that. That's actually quite good. And then get the associated price. So again, marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. That happens here. And that's associated with this quantity that happens under monopoly. So the important lesson here is that the monopolist reduces output. They would have been at this competitive output, but since they have some market power, they can reduce the number of units that are out there, and then they can charge at a higher willingness to pay that we're getting from the demand curve. So remember, our demand is our willingness to pay. That's where we're finding the price. Okay, so what's happened here is the firm has reduced the total output in order to raise the equilibrium price that they would be willing to charge. Okay, so how much profit then do they make? Well, there's your average total cost. So we can calculate that their profit looks something like this, where the price over the average total cost times the monopoly quantity, right? And sort of by happenstance, right, because you could arrange the nature of the cost curves here would be specific to the firm and the industry. This is a typical diagram that you would see of monopoly or a firm with market power. Notice that if we were here, there would actually be a negative profit or a loss, and so we would expect to see that the supply curves would move around if this were a competitive market. But what I've done here is I've combined these marginal cost curves with the demand curve. The monopolist faces the demand curve directly. So that's an important lesson here, right? Monopolists face the demand curve directly. So one of the things, I could say like market demand here as well, face demand curve. Okay, or maybe the demand curve. So what happens is the sort of popular opinion about monopolies is often very wrong, because it has the idea that monopolies can just do whatever they want, and that's not true. It's just that monopolies have some market power. Okay, so hand in hand with that idea is, well, how much is it that a monopolist gets to raise the price if they have market power? Well, if the demand curve that they're facing is very elastic, there are many substitutes for what the monopolist is offering. They have market power, but consumers have the ability to go and find and produce other things, right? Then the price under monopoly compared to the price under competition, that change will be relatively small, right? And we can see that's just a natural artifact coming from, right? Let's remember, marginal cost is the supply curve, right? So our marginal cost is equal to our demand here, right? That would give us this output. So we see this reduction in quantity is accompanied by a relatively small price markup. Now, if there's a very inelastic demand curve, then the monopolist, by reducing the output, can raise the price dramatically. As opposed to the price that happens under competition, we see a very large change in the price under monopoly. So remember that the demand curve still is fundamentally restricting what it is that people are willing to pay. So the monopolist is sort of only one half of the equation, if you will. Okay, so what is it then that monopolists do that really burdens society? What are the costs of monopoly, as it were? Well, the first thing that people like to point out, if we're just sort of having a discussion, is, well, they raised the price. And this is bad, and it absolutely is. I'm not trying to sugarcoat that at all. But what economists really worry about actually is the reduced output. And this goes back to that idea of deadweight loss. So remember, what's happened here is you had an opportunity in a situation where we were producing at the actual equilibrium point between supply and demand, and we had a competitive output. Notice that the intersection of this point that I'm drawing in marginal revenue being equal to 0 is happenstance, so don't read into that too much. But the competitive output looks something like that, and it gives us this price outcome here. Of course, everyone in this course has already been through when we worked through surplus, so I'm going to go through this somewhat quickly. There's the marginal revenue equal to the marginal cost. So if the monopolist comes in, he or she is able to produce here, right? And the consequence of that is the ability to charge this price that's associated with this higher level. So there's the monopoly price, and there's the competition price. So what is it that happened? Well, before we had surplus from the consumer that looked something like that. And now the consumer, again, remember what surplus is, that's when there's value that the consumer is getting that they're not having to pay for because the prevailing market price is less than their willingness to pay, right? And now there wasn't any producer surplus, but now we have this producer surplus that's being transferred from consumer surplus to producer surplus. The outcome then is that this area here used to be consumer surplus, but is now deadweight loss. So conversation that we're familiar with and we've had before, that this is related to that lost surplus. So there's your deadweight loss. Let's go ahead and highlight these other areas now. So this little triangle here, right? This is that consumer surplus. And importantly, this rectangle here is the producer surplus that is gained. That ends up being profit for the monopolist. So we can see how a situation where we had this large consumer surplus before has now been transformed into profit, but the outcome includes deadweight loss to society. Okay, so the other costs of monopoly are related to political economy, and these come in two very important forms. One is corruption, and the other is inefficiency. Let's start with corruption. So the problem is many monopolies, probably most monopolies, honestly, are government created. We'll talk about this more in a moment. But the problem is monopolies are often upstream of other types of firms. If you think about this, your famous monopolies, right, are related to steel and oil production, right? So the problem is monopolies produce inputs, then cause the costs of other things downstream to also be higher. So remember that because monopolies are often formed through regulation, legislation, and policy, that seems like the cost or the downsides of that are localized, but they are not. Those costs are actually made worse and passed downstream through the inputs into other products. Okay. The other type of cost here is inefficiency. Let's take a look at steel production. Let's look first at what happens under competition. So the firm wants to work to reduce cost, because if they're facing competition, that's one of the main ways that they can go about being competitive. So they lower steel prices, which of course translates to increased supply. This increased supply gives more cars at a lower price because the input into cars has been reduced. If we reduce the input cost, then the supply will increase. This leads to more mutually beneficial exchanges, and in fact, more efficient use of resources, and the ripple effects will happen all throughout the economy. Consider instead what happens under a monopoly. The monopolist instead of working to reduce costs, works to raise prices. That's what we've shown up to this point in this video. This leads to higher steel prices, which translate to decreased supply. This gives us fewer cars, and those cars are traded at a higher price. This ends up decreasing the number of mutually beneficial exchanges that happen. Okay, so sometimes monopolies are formed for a reason, and the main reason, in the textbook they call this a benefit, but it's really more of a reason than a benefit, so I've put it in air quotes there, is patent protection. So patent protection is a legal monopoly, right? And it's important because it rewards research and development by encouraging innovation and research based on individuals who are doing that eventually being able to look forward to protecting their ideas and being able to extract some of the benefit out of it. So we think maybe there are some reasons in some cases to protect monopoly. Another way that we get monopolies is through economies of scale. And when we're in this situation, we're going to see some potential for regulation. So first, an economy of scale is an advantage of a large-scale production that reduces average cost as production increases. So some things, the cost of producing them goes down as you get bigger and bigger. Manufacturing, agriculture, things like this is often the case, right? Instead of perhaps farms that are adjacent to each other, each farmer individually owning the equipment that it takes to farm that piece of land. If one person owns all of those pieces of land, the machinery might be larger, might be more specialized, might simply be able to coordinate more efficiently and reduce the average cost of farming those individual farms. It's hard to say in the modern environment how big a part of farming that has become, right? We see large-scale industrial farming, even farmers who own thousands, 3, 4, 5,000 acres here in Texas often can't really make ends meet because they're considered a small or medium-sized farm. So it takes much larger farms in order to do that. Of course, some of that may have to do with regulation and policy, so it's hard to determine what the true economies of scale at play are. Now, economies of scale can cause monopolies, and we call these natural monopolies. So a natural monopoly is when a single firm can supply the entire market at a lower cost than two or more firms. Some examples of this would be subways, water, natural gas, cable television, typically things with extraordinarily large infrastructure needs. It's difficult for more than one firm to try to be providing subways because you have to literally lay rail and potentially even dig tunnels. You don't really want competing rail lines next to each other going all about the countryside. So this is a potential cause of monopoly. Okay, so one way to regulate monopoly is through price control. In general, we see that price controls are a very bad and negative thing. We've argued that elsewhere in this class, and all those argumentations still hold, but remember that we're talking about a bit of a special case here. So let's go back and look at what would happen. Remember what would happen. The monopoly firm would produce where marginal revenue equals marginal cost in order to maximize productivity. We end up with a price that looks like so. You see that there you have some profitability since the average cost is here. Now, if we force the firm all the way to this point, we see that that would actually be a negative profit situation. And so we want to introduce a price control that says, how is it that the firm can stay in operation, but we can reduce some of the costs of monopoly? Well, the answer is to cause the price to be set equal to average total cost. We would then increase quantity like so. Profit would go to zero, but remember that's economic profit, so the opportunity costs of the producers would be covered, and so we would see price go down and quantity go up, but we wouldn't give the monopolist any reason to get out of the market. Now, this is really easy in theory and probably seemed easy just now, and there are reasons to think, okay, if we actually were able to do that, that would be a good thing and that would lead us to good outcomes, right? The problem is this is really, really hard in practice. The first reason that it's hard in practice is it's very difficult to observe these things. I think I've already told the story once before in this class of a former colleague who was arguing with me about pharmaceuticals and said, well, we just look at their revenues and their costs, and we could work out what the price of these pharmaceuticals could be. This is because pharmaceutical companies have a large amount of market power. We've discussed elsewhere in this class why that's a very poor idea. But the other reason that this is very disastrous is it's actually really hard to observe the total cost, especially opportunity costs, and the total revenues from a firm. That's made to sound easy, as if you could just go into a particular firm and take those books and look at those numbers. But you have to remember that really what's driving cost is a set of choices. The other big problem is what we call regulatory capture. So regulatory capture is when a firm or industry under regulation influences regulators such that those regulators align with the regulated interests. A very famous economist named George Stigler was noted for this idea. Stigler was not content to examine the effects of regulation. He wanted to understand its causes. Did governments regulate industries, as many had believed, to reduce the harmful effects of monopoly? Stigler did not think so. In a seminal 1971 article, The Theory of Economic Regulation, he presented and gave evidence for his capture theory. This is regulatory capture. Stigler argued that governments do not end up creating monopoly industries by accident. Rather, they regulate at the behest of producers who, quote, capture the regulatory agency and use regulation to prevent competition. We are seeing this in real time as you are listening to these videos by various social media companies that are essentially asking to be regulated. Probably more important than the evidence itself was the fact that Stigler made his viewpoint respectable in economics profession. It's now the mainstream view to view regulation through the lens of regulatory capture. This is a citation from the Library of Economics and Liberty. So we really have these two problems where even if we could observe enough to set the price equal to the average total costs, I might also comment that it's hard in practice not just to observe but also to implement price controls and for those to reflect prices over time. If you're getting energy production from a firm, you're probably experiencing that they're asking for their prices to be raised. That's because we're really only looking at a snapshot of their costs and revenues. And so they're always going to be making the case with their regulators that they need to be able to charge higher prices for all the various cost reasons. Notice that this also disincentivizes controlling your costs. You want to allow your costs, or you don't have any incentive to not allow your costs to get out of control if you're not making profit, but rather you're being forced where your profitability is equal to zero. And if your costs rise, then the regulator will just allow you to charge a higher set of prices. So we have these three really big problems. It's hard to observe, it's hard to enforce, and it changes over time in addition to this big hurdle called regulatory capture. Okay, finally, we want to look at some sources of market power. Sources of market power always come from barriers to entry, and we want to examine some examples there. So a couple of these we've talked about. One is patents. So patents are important in order to provide the incentive to innovate and do research. A classic example of this is pharmaceuticals, but we see this in lots of different ways. We see this a lot in technology sectors as well. Maybe the biggest one is regulation. USPS is probably the most famous example of this, where they are given market power by virtue of having the backing of the United States government. We've already discussed the economies of scale idea. Subways, water production, we could even argue roads have these economies of scale. Some other ones are unique inputs, right? So we talked about oil, we talked about diamonds, where if the substitutability of your inputs is very low, then people who own or make deals with those who own the resources themselves can sometimes exert market power in those situations. And then finally, innovation or something along the lines of being a first mover gives us an opportunity to exert market power. A good example of this would be something like Apple.